Before I get to that first reading, just again, I want to reemphasize what Jesus said. If you were blind, you would have no sin. And people think that, well, any wrongdoing or any shortcoming is that because God doesn't like you, but that's not the case. And then he goes on saying, but now you're saying we see, and so your sin remains. We have to acknowledge our sins and trust that God's going to forgive us of our sins. But the first thing we got to do is acknowledge that we can't see, that we do sin, and then turn to God all the more in this beautiful sacrament of confession. I want to get to Samuel and explain who he is, but again, as you know, I got to do it in the context of the history of biblical history. Again, remember, there's a God of Abraham, Isaac, and then Jacob, and he changed his name to Israel. And then Israel has 12 sons and 1 daughter. Now, the key to all this is, if you recall then, that Israel really liked this one son, Joseph, who was the second youngest of the 12 brothers. And so at one point during this scene, Israel sends Joseph out to his 10 older brothers, and he says, hey, go help them or do whatever. And then the 10 older brothers, because they were jealous, they had murderous thoughts about Joseph. And they were going to kill him and say that he was attacked by an animal. But then Judah, the 4th brother and the youngest of the oldest wife, Leah, Judah said, hey, let's not kill him. Let's throw him in a pit. And then he found some Ishmaelites, and they said, let's sell him into a slave. And then that's where Joseph ended up in Egypt. And then after the famine, the whole family ended up in Egypt because of a famine that brought him there. And Joseph grew in the Egyptian culture. But here's the key here too. So Judah was a key guy, the brother that saved Joseph. And then after the famine hit, where the 12 tribes of Israel were forced to go to Egypt, it was Judah that did negotiating. To the point where before Israel died, he in chapter 49 of Genesis, it was Israel that said, and you, Judah, the scepter will not leave your hand, that you will be a king forever. Okay, now we fast forward 430 years where Moses is leading them out of enslavement. And then after they got into Israel, the country, the promised land, they were run by loosely confederation of judges. And now we're getting to Samuel. So about 1,100 years before Jesus was born, they wanted a king. And Samuel is the last of the judges. He also happens to be a prophet and a priest. So evidently came from the tribe of the Levites. So what does Samuel do? God tells Samuel to go anoint the first king of Israel, and that's Saul. And then Saul falls out of favor with God, and then he asks, and here's where we catch up with Samuel. Then God tells Samuel to go down to the country of Judah, because that's where the true king is going to come from. And so Samuel takes his horn of oil and makes a track south to the southern country, tribe of Judah, and he finds King David and anoints him king. And then before David dies, of course, you know that his kingdom will last forever, and it does through his son Solomon and Rehoboam, and then eventually to Jesus, and the kingdom is in heaven there. So, and then remember too, in some prophecies, like Isaiah 11, it looked like the promise was not going to happen, but then God tells Isaiah from the stump of Jesse, who's the daddy of King David, that his kingdom will last forever. And so we got that whole dynamic in Samuel there. But Samuel is the last of the judges, and then he anoints his successor that's going to take care of things, and that is Saul, and then eventually David. Now let's get to this beautiful story of John here. In the story of Jesus having this encounter with the blind man, this only happens in John's gospel. Okay? And like everything, we can't help but to put ourselves in these positions that we read about. So we are the blind man. So I want to remind you that the blind man was made capable of seeing, not so much through the mud and saliva, but through Jesus, right? And then I want to remind you in Genesis 2nd chapter, just 2 chapters into the Bible, God created man out of dust. And it wasn't the dust that created man, it was God using the elements of dust and creating man. So then you fast forward to Jesus then, and Jesus is using dust. He takes up dust, he throws saliva in there, which is kind of icky, but he does it anyway. And then he smears in the man's eyes, and scholars believe that this is this is a foretaste of baptism. That what Jesus did was he recreated a man, the man. He's reborn into a man who's able to see. And if I want to remind you with the sacrament of baptism, that this coming Easter, we're going to baptize a lot of people, and leading into the Easter sacraments. And when people get baptized, before they get baptized, they're one type of person. And then after baptism, there's something completely different. Philosophers and theologians call it an ontological change. Ontology is a study of what a thing is. And so when people enter the baptismal water, they get completely changed to something completely different. Their ontology, who they are, is completely different. Now, with this man who's born blind, then God gives him, Jesus Christ, gives him ability to see the reality in front of him. But notice how there's a process. He has this ability to see, but this process of seeing reality is a process. So Jesus gives him the ability, and then the people bring him to the Pharisees. And the Pharisees say, well, what do you say of yourself? And the man's able to see this part of Jesus, that he's a prophet. Although you and I know he's more than a prophet. And so does this man eventually. And then, of course, they dismiss him and they bring in his parents. And then they dismiss the parents and they bring Jesus in, bring the blind man in again. He says, well, what do you say about him? And then the blind man says, he is of God. So notice how there's a step up in what he's able to see in the reality of Jesus. Jesus gives him this ability to see, but the process of seeing the greater and greater reality is just that. It's a process. Okay, then they dismiss him, and as you know, then Jesus catches up with this guy. And he says, do you believe in the Son of Man? Now, I want to remind you that the Son of Man is a title that Jesus embraces more so than any other title. And I also will remind you that the Son of Man, that title actually points to his divinity more so than it points to his humanity. And why do scholars say that? Because they look at the words of Daniel, the prophet, and Ezekiel the prophet, and they connect one like the Son of Man to be the Son of God coming down from heaven. And so Jesus asked him this question, do you believe in the Son of Man? And the answer is, well, who is he, sir? And then Jesus says, I am he, the one who you're seeing, because I gave you that ability to see. And then, of course, the man born blind says, I do believe, Lord. And then John says, and he worshiped him. He believes that Jesus is God. He's more than a prophet. He's priest, prophet, and king. Now, this man, his relationship with Jesus is really close to our relationship with Jesus. That at baptism, we're given the eyes of faith. And then, like with these eyes of faith, we get the process of seeing God more and more clearly in our lives. My spiritual director just a couple of months ago gave me this exercise, and basically it is to come in front of Jesus in the tabernacle, and ask Jesus to appear to you and be clear to you the reality of him in your lives. And so the last couple months I've been doing that. And I want to encourage you, you have the eyes of faith. It was a gift to you with baptism. You have it. You have the ability to see Jesus in your lives. And now I want to encourage you during the rest of this time of Lent to come to this church building. This church building doesn't get locked up until 9 or 10 o'clock in the evening. And bring your family and give them just 5 minutes to stare at Jesus, and you stare at Jesus and let Jesus stare at you, because you have the eyes of faith because of baptism. And then through your eyes of faith, ask Jesus to help you see Jesus all the more in your lives. Every aspect of your lives. Not just the good times, but especially when you go through the traumas of life. Turn to Jesus and say, Jesus, help me. Help me to see you in those times when it's just flat more difficult to see you. And even demand it. Come on, Jesus, help me. I know you want to. Just help me to see you. And so let's not waste the rest of this Lenten season, but let's truly recognize that Jesus gave us the gift of faith. And now Jesus, it's an ongoing process. Let's ask Jesus to break open the eyes of faith and to see him clearly in our lives, and especially in this world where there's so much evil in this world. But yet, despite all that evil and all the trauma that we go through, we believe through the eyes of faith that Jesus is truly present.